From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening. We begin in Washington tonight, where the Supreme Court has ended its 1987-88 term with a host of decisions that will have a broad impact in the land. The court has made decisions having to do with sex offenders and the death penalty and civil rights on the job. It has also upheld the law which provides for an independent counsel, such as the one who's been investigating the Iran-Contra affair. Here is our law correspondent, Tim O'Brien.
The Supreme Court rejected arguments that having federal judges appoint independent counsel to investigate wrongdoing in the executive branch violated the separation of powers required by the Constitution. Chief Justice William Rehnquist wrote the decision, emphasizing that once the selection is made, the roles of Congress and the judiciary are minimal, and that the White House retains some authority to fire whomever is chosen. President Reagan shrugged off the ruling, although his Justice Department had asked the court to rule the other way.
Well, these are all tough constitutional issues, and we put up, on behalf of the administration, the best legal arguments that we can, and obviously on the court itself there were strong differences on this issue.
The ruling was a blow to former White House aides Michael Deaver and Lynn Notziger, whose recent convictions might well have been overturned had the independent counsel law been thrown out. Before calling it quits for the summer, the justices also announced 3 major rulings involving young people. They set aside the death sentence ordered for Wayne Thompson because he was so young, only 15, when he murdered his brother-in-law. But the court stopped short of saying the death penalty is unconstitutional for all juvenile offenders, agreeing only that if a state wants to execute anyone under 16 at the time of the crime, some minimum age must be specified in its laws. In another case, the justices upheld the so-called chastity law, which provides federal funding for religious groups counseling young women to abstain from sex before marriage. The court said the law itself didn't violate separation of church and state, but warned that funding may be cut off in individual cases if the money is used to promote religion. In another major ruling today, the justices made it more difficult to prosecute child molestation cases. They reversed the conviction of John Avery Coy because the state put this screen between him and his alleged victims, 2 13-year-old girls, when they testified against Coy. The court acknowledged that such devices may make testifying less traumatic for young victims, but that Coy and all criminal defendants have a constitutional right to confront their accusers face to face.
It's going to make it harder to convict some guilty sex offenders, but it's going to make it much harder to convict innocent sex offenders.
The ruling is a departure from a growing trend at the court to favor law enforcement and to write narrow decisions. In fact, the term that ended today, more than any other, reflects the imprint of Ronald Reagan and his 3 conservative appointments to the court. You just wouldn't know it by the opinions the justices expressed today. Tim O'Brien, ABC News at the Supreme Court.
And there was an important civil rights ruling from the court today which makes it easier for people to prove their bosses are guilty of discrimination. It says that even an employer's subjective decisions can be held up to review. In other words, a person can use statistics to prove an employer has a history of not hiring or promoting minorities or women. And the court has made a ruling on when a labor union can collect fees from non-union workers. The court said that in a closed shop, those fees can only be used for collective bargaining purposes and no other, not, for example, for any political lobbying. In a moment, President Reagan plunges into the next presidential campaign. And later in the broadcast, the mammoth traffic jam on the nation's highways.
Very difficult.
And as the world turns, one woman's search for a daytime Emmy.
This is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. Brought to you by Woolite.
For those of you wondering exactly when President Reagan would make good on his pledge to get really partisan in the next presidential campaign, today was the day. And you know how the president feels about Democrats. ABC's Sheila Cass was with him in Florida.
It was a fundraiser for Congressman Connie Mack, Senate candidate and grandson of a famous baseball manager. But President Reagan used it to make a pitch for a whole team.
I mean real major leaguers. Senator Connie Mack and President George Bush.
Mr. Reagan did not so much praise Bush as attack his Democratic rival, without mentioning Michael Dukakis by name.
Should we expect that if the Democrats, all but certain presidential candidate is elected, that he would raise taxes? Yep. In fact, he just did.
The president mocked Dukakis' approval of a cigarette tax increase to balance the Massachusetts budget and called him a true liberal.
He spent every dime and more of the revenue generated in his state by the Reagan-Bush recovery.
Part of this elaborately staged event was aimed at Hispanic voters, where Dukakis' appeal is seen as stronger. The president promised the U.S. would not normalize relations with Cuba. Campaigning in Wisconsin, Bush welcomed his stand-in support.
I'm grateful to him because he will have great credibility in putting our record in the good, sensible perspective that it deserves to be.
The president's aides predict he'll strike this theme often, calling the Democratic opponent a tax-hiking, big-spending liberal. It worked for Mr. Reagan 4 years ago. The question is how much will rub off on George Bush now? Sheila Cast, ABC News, Miami.
Mr. Dukakis was quick to fire back. This administration, he said, has piled up more red ink than the presidencies of George Washington to Jimmy Carter combined. Dukakis was on Capitol Hill, still looking for the right running mate. Here's ABC's Sam Donaldson.
Governor Dukakis brought his search mission for a running mate to Capitol Hill this morning, amid heavy betting by many political observers that he will ultimately settle on the war hero astronaut senator from Ohio, John Glenn.
Would you like the job?
I don't have any comment on it at all.
But when Dukakis left the Capitol late this afternoon, he had no announcement to deliver.
I can't say at this point that I'm either close or not so close. These things have a way of sorting themselves out. We're making good progress.
Dukakis met one-on-one with 4 Democratic senators: Glenn, Graham of Florida, Benson of Texas, and Nunn of Georgia, who had already signaled he wasn't interested, and today closed the door to the governor face-to-face.
I'm honored to be considered. I am not interested in being vice president. He understands that. He has accepted that. He was very gracious about it.
Nunn's withdrawal only fueled speculation that Glenn, no stranger to being looked over for the vice presidency, would get the nod. In 1976, Glenn made the trek to Plains, Georgia, for a looking over by Jimmy Carter. But then all he got was a touch of heat stroke and a ration of gnat bites. This time, however, he is widely seen as exactly the type of person Dukakis needs.
John Glenn gives him some experience in military and international and national security affairs. It's terribly important for him. John Glenn represents an important state.
Ohio and the Midwest are so important to Dukakis that some observers believe he's already settled on Glenn, a belief Dukakis angrily denied.
Well, that's inaccurate.
One rap on Glenn has always been that he's boring. But with no presidential nominee wanting to be upstaged by his running mate, in Dukakis' case, that could turn out to be just another plus for him. Sam Donaldson, ABC News, Capitol Hill.
A couple of other notes, some good news in the polls today for George Bush. The latest ABC News poll, in conjunction with Money magazine, shows an almost even presidential race. Dukakis leads Mr. Bush by only 3 points, which could be a statistical dead heat. That is to say, it is within the margin of error. In late May, our polling unit showed Dukakis with an 11-point lead. Republican Party leaders have chosen the governor of New Jersey, Thomas Kean, to deliver the keynote speech to the party's convention in August. Kean has often taken the public position that the Republican Party must reach beyond its traditional base to bring in more women and more minorities. Well, spirits soared in parts of the Midwest today after the first significant rainfall in months. However, the high hopes were shattered by meteorologists who say the precipitation was not a drought breaker, and that the long-range outlook for most areas is still dismal. Here's ABC's Chris Bury.
No, it's going to rain, by God. That looks like rain over there.
On his Wisconsin farm last night, Tom Sarbacher looked up to the sky and saw what looked like his first good news in a month. What another farmer called a nice, slow, blessed rain.
We'll take whatever we can get. The corn will grow. In 2-3 days, the corn will grow like you wouldn't believe it.
The badly needed rain fell in a hit-and-miss pattern across the Midwest. La Crosse, Wisconsin got 2 inches, Omaha and Nebraska 2.5. But much of Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois saw only traces of rain or none at all.
It's just a mere drop in the bucket for what we need.
Illinois farmers were frustrated by less than half an inch of rain, too little too late for corn crops at the critical pollination stage.
If the rain doesn't come, then we simply won't have a crop. It's that simple.
And hope sank even more this afternoon when the National Weather Service issued its forecast for the next 90 days.
Both the medium range and the monthly forecast have the worst combination of hot and dry in the old Midwest.
Meanwhile, low river levels caused by the drought continue to back up barges on the Ohio and Mississippi. Today, the Coast Guard restricted river traffic because so many tugboats are running aground. Across the Midwest, fireworks dealers shut their doors as their sales were banned because of the danger of fire. So even 4th of July celebrations could be victims of the drought. Chris Bury, ABC News, Chicago.
On Wall Street, the Dow Jones Industrials lost almost 9 points today, and the trading was moderate. The bad news was finally official today for workers at the Tennessee Valley Authority, the giant federally owned power company. In a speech televised to TVA offices across 7 states, Chairman Marvin Runyon said 7,500 employees, nearly a quarter of the TVA workforce, will have to go. Here's ABC's Jackie Judd.
The workers watched with anxiety as the new TVA chairman announced the layoffs.
Up until today, I think a lot of us still had hope. Today, we know that there's no hope.
It's a long way from the TVA created by FDR's New Deal to generate electricity and jobs amid the poverty.
TVA was created for you. The land is yours. The dams are yours. The whole TVA is yours.
The TVA grew into the nation's largest utility. Until today, it also was one of the most secure places to work in the Tennessee Valley.
I had just accepted the fact that I could retire from here, and I look forward to doing that. But now, that will not be.
But when Marvin Runyon took on the TVA job 5 months ago, he inherited an agency billions of dollars in debt, principally because of expensive nuclear plants, many of which have been mothballed.
The nuclear program got into trouble because of safety features. With the money they had put in it, it turned out to be a disaster.
Runyon plans to operate the government agency like a lean private company. To compete with neighboring utilities, he's freezing rates for 3 years.
And where I've come from, you don't just pass your price along to the customers because the customers stop buying your products.
To chop $300 million from the budget, Runyon is reorganizing management and laying off workers by the thousands. It's a blow to cities like Chattanooga, where TVA is the largest employer.
TVA is a real strong factor in the local economy. So it does make a difference. It will hurt.
I'm not doing any shopping. I'm not going to buy the house I had planned to buy.
Marvin Runyon's drive to make TVA more competitive doesn't end with today's announcement. There will be more streamlining. And this new day for the agency is also a new economic reality for the communities that depend on it. Jackie Judd, ABC News, Chattanooga.
When we come back, approaching gridlock on the nation's roads. Report tonight that affects just about every American who drives to work, and that is more than 96 million people. A group of highway officials from around the country held a news conference today to release a report called Beyond Gridlock. The facts are not surprising. The nation's highways, already heavily congested, are becoming worse. They are becoming so in part because so many Americans now commute from the suburbs where they live to other suburbs where they work. Our chief correspondent, Richard Threlkeld, reports on the national traffic jam.
Even at 5:30 in the morning, there's a trickle of traffic on Route 128 that connects the high-tech belt around Boston. By 8 a.m., traffic is heavy well outside the city. It's a torrent. And Liz Varga, en route from her home in Methuen to her job at the GTE labs in Waltham, is caught in it, along with 150,000 others.
It's basically like a job before the job. I'm on the road for, I'd say, anywhere from an hour to 2 hours before I even start my job.
Like Mrs. Varga, most of these drivers aren't even going to Boston. They're commuting from suburb to suburb and spending 5 hours a week on average stuck in traffic. From Boston to San Diego, gridlocks moved from the big city to the suburbs. Why all the traffic? No big mystery. Americans want to live in the suburbs, and that's where 2/3 of all the new jobs are. And they want to drive to work alone in their own cars. Less than 5% carpool. And so far, in order to do all that, they've been willing to put up with this.
Very difficult from well south of Atlantic now, so you'll need some extra time there.
Grab a shoehorn and try and squeeze in. We're stacked up for 3 miles going into the town.
Heavy as usual coming in from Highway 5 all the way through Delk Road.
And it's only going to get worse. America's automobile population is growing almost twice as fast as the human population. Forget the 2-car family. 14% of us are now 3-car families. And mass transportation, less than 5% of us use it. All the money that cities like Boston once spent on it never took the suburbs into account.
Those investments were not made because the highways were built. The assumption was that the highway would handle that traffic ad infinitum, I think.
The assumption was wrong, and the assumption that anytime you needed a bigger and better highway, you just went out and built it. These days, there are not only lots of new government regulations, but suburbanites are raising all kinds of objections, environmental and otherwise.
The reason people like to live out there is the pleasant two-line country road and the stone wall and the maple trees. And if I go out there and start cutting down the maple trees and knocking down the stone walls, they're going to say, not on your life.
And things are no better in America's downtown. Boston's Central Artery, built 30 years ago, now has to handle more than twice the traffic it was designed for, and it's falling apart. It will cost $3 billion and 10 years of work just to keep downtown Boston from coming to a permanent stop. So that's how bad the traffic is today. And tomorrow, the government estimates that by the year 2005, our stop-and-go traffic will be 10 times more stop than go than it is right now. Richard Threlkeld, ABC News on Route 128.
Tomorrow we'll look at some possible high-tech solutions to the traffic mess. And when we come back, Mikhail Gorbachev. He gets some unprecedented criticism, some of it in public. Overseas now, in Moscow, the 5,000 delegates to the Soviet Party conference watched an unusual spectacle today. Speakers at a major official gathering disagreeing with their leader in public view. Yesterday, Mikhail Gorbachev called for sweeping changes within the Soviet society, and he has been very active in encouraging debate. Today he got it. Here's ABC's Walter Rogers.
When the party conference delegates gathered in the Kremlin today, the stage was set for unprecedented blunt speeches and debates that even criticized Soviet leader Gorbachev's policy of greater openness and political reform. Delegates disagreed over Gorbachev's proposal for limiting a Soviet leader's term in office to 10 years. Old survivors of the system said no one should serve more than that.
I think history will teach us that if Stalin had retired in 1934 and Brezhnev retired in 1974, our country would not have lost so much.
A conservative backlash developed over loosening censorship of the news media. This delegate complaining, some people think glasnost is permissiveness, but Mr. Gorbachev would not retreat.
Perestroika will die should we give up advancing the process of glasnost, criticism, self-criticism, and democracy. We have firmly embarked on the road of glasnost and will follow it unswervingly.
Soviet bureaucrats, the people who draft all the red tape regulations, became a favorite target of speakers like this man who proposed a Stalinist solution to the problem.
We are always fighting paper and red tape and bureaucracy. Perhaps we should shoot the people who invent the paperwork.
But the hall became noticeably tense when Leonid Abalkin, a leading economist, told delegates Mr. Gorbachev's policy of perestroika or restructuring has done nothing to improve the Soviet economy.
Soviet television is only allowed to show part of what's taking place here, so we can't be sure how Mr. Gorbachev reacted to that challenge. But even with this officially censored glimpse of the party conference, we may be witnessing the most open and lively debates here since the Bolshevik Revolution. Walter Rogers, ABC News, Moscow.
News here today about the Middle East. A federal judge ruled today that the United States cannot close down the Palestine Liberation Organization's mission to the United Nations. The court said the act of Congress requiring the mission to close cannot take precedence over the government's agreement to have the United Nations in New York. This will actually please the Reagan administration, which had fought against the law. The pilot and co-pilot of the Air France Airbus, which crashed and killed 3 people at an air show in France on Sunday, are blaming their plane for the crash. They say the jet's altitude instruments didn't work and the engines were slow to respond to their commands. A preliminary government report has said there was no mechanical failure. In sports, bad news for the big stars at Wimbledon today. The defending champion Pat Cash is out. He was defeated by Boris Becker, and Mats Wilander, who had already won the Australian and French championships, lost in the quarterfinals at Wimbledon to the 9th-seeded Czech Miroslav Maciej. When we come back, we'll have our final report. Lucci's lament. Cursed, foiled again. Finally here this evening, the queen of the soaps. Here in New York, this was the day that they handed out the Emmy Awards for daytime television. We confess that in this bureau we kept half an eye on the proceedings to see whether this year finally, after 9 years of being nominated, Erica would finally get the recognition for everything she's been through. It's been a real cliffhanger. And here's ABC's Beth Nissen.
She's a vamp, a vixen, a viper. She's Susan Lucci, known to millions of soap opera fans as the treacherous Erica Kane on the top-rated soap All My Children.
I think what happens is that the character of Erica is such a caricature that she's just not taken seriously.
I'm a star. I worked and clawed my way to the top.
Her fans think it's time Erica got her claws into an Emmy.
She does a good job. I mean, she really makes you want to hate her.
She's evil, but she's good. I've been hoping she'd win all year. Last year I was really upset.
Lucci certainly seems to deserve something after all she's been through in 18 years of playing Erica.
I was always a loving and a giving woman.
She married Jeff, divorced Jeff. She fell in love with Jason, but her mother killed Jason. She married Phil, divorced Phil, had an affair with Phil's father, nearly had an affair with her own half-brother, and settled for an affair with her boss Tom. She married Tom, divorced Tom. Then there was Brandon, whom she dumped for Kent, but she accidentally killed Kent, was sentenced to the electric chair, and acquitted at the last minute. She fell in love with Mike, but he went to Tibet, so she married Adam. Mike came back, but he died too. So she finally married Travis and gave birth to what looked like a 3-month-old baby in March. So how would Erica handle being passed over so often for top honors?
Oh, Erica would have charged the stage years ago and taken that thing.
She should have charged the stage this year. Lucci lost again. Still no happy ending to one of the longest dramas in daytime television. Beth Nissen, ABC News, New York.
That's our report on World News Tonight. I'm Peter Jennings. Have a nice evening. Good night.
From ABC, this has been World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Wednesday, Mike's in way over his head.
Oh, hi. You didn't tell me you had a little sister.
No, this is my daughter.
Growing phase. Then Fillmore High hits the talk show circuit.
Hi, I'm Oprah Winfrey.
Head of the class.
Tonight,